Can I thank CEDA and everybody this afternoon for coming along, to Paula Rogers and Stephen. Thank you to Mike Nahan, my parliamentary colleague, Paul Papalia, and if there are any other state MPs who aren't outdoor knocking, good to see you too. It is an exciting time to be here. It's nice to take a small bit of time out from the excitement and trauma that is the state election campaign. Can I just begin by saying that this election, 2017, this year, WA stands on the cusp of an opportunity to remove a tired old government, wedded to 8.5 years of decisions, and to embrace a new narrative built around reform of government, a plan for jobs, refreshed public transport and, something I'll say a bit more about shortly, a new port. Importantly, if elected, WA Labor will be a government that listens, engages and develops policy hand in hand with our community, including, in particular, the business community, rather than announce to the community what policy will be. And much has been said about the state of the WA finances. And after what has been the greatest period of wealth creation in our state's history, despite record revenues, yes, even accounting for the GST, people quite rightly ask the question, how did we find ourselves with debt and deficits of such magnitude? Despite the balance sheet, government continues. Over the coming 4 years, the government is still projected to spend $121 billion. It's how and where that money is spent that ultimately guides the debate around election time. The Liberal government is wedded to nearly a decade of decisions. It has become stale, rigid, and unable to adequately respond to new and emerging issues, indeed even contemptuous of such issues. The opportunity of a new government is that it resets the decision record and allows new decisions to be made, old decisions to be abandoned and a new agenda to be pursued. Regardless of your view of WA Labor, we have not been an inactive opposition. We have worked hard to cement relations with the business community, often with strong critique from my colleagues in the Parliament. We have developed and issued a wide range of policy, whether they be Metronet, a plan for jobs, tourism, health. We have put positions out into the public debate, and many of you in this room have worked with WA Labor to assist us in our policy development, and I thank you sincerely for your input. And while this coming election has many moving parts, we're seeing that play out in the media on a daily basis, it is still fundamentally one of the government and the opposition, of Liberal and Labor. A government offering a combination of a new mining tax and, make no mistake, as Mr Grills has pointed out time and again, a re-elected coalition government will introduce some form of a mining tax, and the sale of Western Power to fund a new trajectory of spending, or an opposition that is so outrageous as to be reallocating money in the budget. Perhaps the most significant announcement made by WA Labor was Mark McGowan's speech to CEDA in December last year. This announced WA Labor's intention to undertake a comprehensive reform of the general government sector, our services priority review. Such reviews are not uncommon for newly elected governments, but they are non-existent from a re-elected governments simply because they are inevitably bound to the many decisions over the last near decade. Our review was reported and referenced by Mike in his speech almost solely on WA Labor's intention to reduce the number of senior executive positions. Again, not unusual for a newly elected government. But the real story in this review is the intentions for government reform and the targets it sets. A fundamental rebasing of the general government sector, a target to reduce the number of departments and agencies by 20%, and to hold the CEOs and Directors General to account for the priorities of government and to pay them according to these results. And can I say how delighted I am so many of them appear to be in the room this afternoon. And an efficient, sustainable public sector that presents itself this way to the public it serves. The only surprising aspect of this announcement is that it's not already in place. Yes, our review will be tasked to identify significant recurrent savings across government, as we do need to rebase our spending that has surged over the past 8.5 years, particularly the first year of the Barnett Liberal government, the first term, of the Barnett Liberal government. This will allow for WA Labor's priorities to be implemented, but also to allow a more sustainable base to the general government sector for the future. I remind you all that, without a word on potential savings prior to the 2008 election, Mr Buswell's review, titled The Economic Audit, rapidly found $1.25 billion in recurrent savings across a spend of $86 billion, significantly less than the $121 billion across the coming years. Our review is needed, timely, achievable, and is the only method by which the general government sector can be reformed and the ongoing recurrent spend of government made sustainable across the medium term. And I talk about the general government sector as it is this that is the story of the state's debt position. When WA Labor lost the 2008 election, the general government sector was net debt-free. By the end of this financial year, it is expected that the general government sector will contain 60% of the entire net debt of the state, and by 2020, 65%. And this is the fundamental story of the government, a break from the two-decade-old consensus that non-income generating assets be funded from current revenues. This is why the Premier, in his first substantive speech to the Parliament as an MP, stated, and I quote, "We need to shift the financing of non-income generating assets away from debt finance into finance from current revenues. That is the socially responsible thing to do, it is the economically responsible thing to do, and for this generation, it is a fair thing to do for the coming generation." Indeed. This is important as everyone needs to understand that the sale of Western Power will not reduce this net debt in the general government sector by 1 cent, not one. It will in fact make it harder to manage the debt as we remove the revenue from Western Power from our general government revenue base. This is why, in commenting and advising the New South Wales government, UBS described the fiscal impact of the sale of the state's energy assets as, and I quote, "likely to worsen its fiscal position in the long run." It is a monopoly asset that is important to ordinary Western Australians, and so WA Labor will not privatise it. I have spoken to many of you about the elephant rampaging through the state's finances, and that is health. Nobody disputes the fact that this current government has spent a lot of money on health. They have indeed, huge sums. However, it is the increased percentage of the total spend and the poor efficiency of that spend that should concern every Western Australian. From 2001 to 2008, the health spend sat consistently around 20 to 24% of the entire annual general government spend. Since 2008, health's share of the budget pie has increased to 29% and is going only one way. Of more concern is the efficiency of the health spend. The 2014-15 state budget had a key budget strategy that assumed convergence between the cost of delivering public hospital services in WA with the national average cost of hospital services by 17-18. At that time, our costs were 8% higher. A year later, that differential had grown to 10.3%, and by the time of the current budget had grown to 18%, and this key budget strategy to converge was officially abandoned by the government. This is why WA Labor has announced what will, in effect, for those who have been around a while, become the Reid Review Part 2, a fundamental review of the health system to guide government to bring sustainability to their health system. In developing our draft terms of reference, WA Labor has taken advice from a range of health experts, both medical and financial. And it is my view WA has a tremendous opportunity to benefit from national and international learnings around procurement, strategic sourcing, integrated pathways and culture change which contribute to better patient care. WA Labor will very shortly release its draft terms of reference in this space. But I'll be frank, if this is not done, the question will shortly have to be asked, regardless of who wins the 2017 election, what areas is government willing to get out of to allow health to continue to take up ever-increasing part of the budget pie? For too long in WA, the debate around the provision and funding of major state infrastructure has been reactive, ill-informed and led by the whims of the Premier. This has to stop. This is why WA Labor has announced the establishment of Infrastructure WA to assist in the development of a state infrastructure strategy. Personally, I see it modelled on Infrastructure Victoria, that developed a 30-year strategy and, importantly, assesses new models of funding infrastructure. This is new to WA and will ensure that we have a body that can make sophisticated and persuasive submissions to Infrastructure Australia, a capacity that our state has sorely lacked. We must, as a state, be able to present more than one business case for one particular piece of infrastructure at a time to Infrastructure Australia. Indeed, as Peter Newman said in a CEDA function last year, the WA government has adopted, and I quote, a cocktail party approach to infrastructure funding, where a state minister sidles up to a federal minister and pitches an idea. This cannot continue. For the private sector, rather than infrastructure that appears in fully costed election campaigns, only to disappear shortly thereafter, Infrastructure WA means that you can have the confidence in the long-term planning arrangements around key state infrastructure. As you are no doubt aware, WA Labor is committed to MetroNet. It is somewhat different to its first iteration, but still a fundamental revolution of our public transport system. And public transport is Labor's bread and butter. We announced our costings and funding package earlier this week, and it is affordable, realistic, and relies on a range of funding sources, including for the first time a concerted effort to capture value from the spend of public monies applied to some specific stations. And can I say, there has been real enthusiasm for engaging the private sector in the planning of MetroNet, both in its design and in its funding. And I could, just to respond to Mike, say to you today that a future Labor government will not raise taxes and levies, but the value of that is probably as much value as the last time I stood before you in this event with Troy Buswell on the other side. He made the same commitment. Of course, we saw many land taxes and levies rise over the course of the subsequent 4 years. I want to make some comment on a key piece of infrastructure that, if I can have a role in getting started, I will retire from this political game happy, and that is a new port at Kwinana. This is truly transformative for the WA economy. We are an export economy, and our port in Fremantle is old and constrained. This is a prime example of the need for Infrastructure WA. The only real piece of rigorous work that has been done is to its credit by the City of Kwinana. The business case for this sort of asset should have been done years ago by state government and highlights the fundamental importance of Infrastructure WA. This is why it is WA Labor's view that public ownership of Fremantle Port is so vital, as it allows for the development of a new port and the transition of activity to it. The government refers to a new port at Kwinana only as overflow, and for the life of me I cannot understand why anyone, be it public or private, would invest in new port facilities for overflow purposes only. While the detailed work needs to be done, I see the private sector, as Mark McGowan said at CEDA last in December, as playing a large role in funding the new port. And from the many meetings I've had around this, there is real appetite for this proposal. WA Labor has many proposals that have been announced over the last 12 months, including reform of the unsolicited bids process to more adequately recognise those companies that make the effort and take on the sometimes not inconsiderable expense in putting together a bid. A bold and proud policy to increase the amount of work we do on our rail cars locally. The only organisation that seems to think that 2% local content is appropriate is the state government. Bringing the ERA, the economic regulator, back into the process of an independent report on microeconomic reform, again started by Mr Buswell and abandoned by Mr Nahan. Fundamental reform of a tired, inefficient procurement process that fails to maximise the purchasing power of government by regularly testing contracts and providers. Expanding the innovation agenda to broaden its focus from simply technology. Social innovation, impact investing, all areas that I am keen to explore as Treasurer and as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. And finally, two areas that I'm particularly proud of, to aggressively move to divest the 10% of Western Australia that is held in the Aboriginal Lands Trust, to ensure Aboriginal people have the economic opportunities that this vast land estate held on their behalf, and to create a WA Aboriginal Ranger program to provide employment and embrace the vast interior of our state in which our cultural identity lies. All in WA Labor are excited by the opportunity to bring a fresh approach to government in Western Australia. And I hope I have the opportunity to work with you all as State Treasurer as to achieve what we need to in this great state. Everyone in this room and the organisations that you represent will need to step up and ensure that the government can do what it needs to do and what it should do. I look forward to your questions.